Isla, a fiercely independent healer from a border village long at odds with the crown, is dragged before Alpha King Roarke's court after her people refuse to pay an unjust tax. When every noble in the hall bows, Isla stays standing, not out of ignorance, but defiance. Instead of punishing her, Roarke finds himself unable to look away. What begins as a battle of wills becomes something neither of them expected. Isla had been taught, since she was old enough to understand the word, that bowing to the crown meant bowing to everything the crown had taken from her village: the grain, the grazing land, the sons conscripted into wars they never voted for. So when she was dragged into the Alpha King's court in chains, surrounded by nobles dropping to their knees around her, she did the only thing that felt honest. She stayed standing. The entire hall went silent. Guards shifted uneasily, waiting for the order to force her down. Nobles whispered behind gloved hands, scandalized. Alpha King Roarke rose slowly from his throne, and for one terrible moment, Isla was certain she'd just signed her own execution. Instead, he descended the dais step by step until he stood directly before her, towering and unreadable, studying her with an intensity that made the silence in the hall feel deafening. "Everyone in this room bows to me," he said quietly. "Tell me why you don't." "Because you haven't earned it," Isla said, chin high despite the chains at her wrists. Something shifted behind his eyes, not fury, as she expected, but something far more dangerous: interest. "Release her chains," Roarke said, without looking away from her once. "I find I'm curious what else this woman refuses to give me without cause." Isla had ridden 2 days to reach the capital, wrists bound to the saddle of a royal guard's horse. Her village's refusal to pay the crown's new grain tax, apparently serious enough offense to warrant a personal military escort rather than a simple summons. She'd expected fear to set in at some point during the journey. It hadn't. If anything, the 2 days of hard riding through unfamiliar territory had only hardened her resolve, each mile further from home settling into cold determination rather than the panic she suspected her captors expected from her. "You'll kneel when we arrive," the guard captain told her flatly, somewhere on the second day, breaking the long silence between them. He was an older man, weathered by years of service, his tone carrying more warning than cruelty. "Whatever pride you're carrying with you, I'd advise leaving it on the road before we reach the throne room. The Alpha King doesn't tolerate defiance in his own court, and I've seen what happens to those who test that particular rule." "Then he'll have to tolerate it today," Isla said, chin lifting despite the chains chafing at her wrists, "because I don't intend to bow to a man who's never once set foot in my village, yet feels entitled to claim half of everything it produces without so much as an explanation." The captain hadn't argued further, though something like reluctant respect had flickered briefly across his weathered face before he turned his attention back to the road ahead. Isla wondered, not for the first time, how many other prisoners he'd escorted to this same fate, and how many of them had arrived considerably more frightened than defiant. She thought of her village as the countryside shifted from familiar hills to unfamiliar capital roads, thought of old Mobbin, whose hip had never healed properly since the harvest accident 3 winters back, and young Tam, whose mother had died bringing him into the world during the worst famine the border territories had ever seen. She thought of grain stores already dangerously low, and a tax collector's demand that would empty what little remained entirely. Someone needed to stand against decisions made by people who'd never missed a single meal in their comfortable lives. If that someone had to be her, dragged in chains before an Alpha King notorious for his temper, then so be it. The throne room, when she finally stood inside it, proved larger and colder than anything her border village upbringing had prepared her for. Towering stone walls stretched upward into shadow, iron sconces casting flickering light across a hall filled with nobles in fine silks and velvets, their collective presence making Isla acutely aware of her own travel-worn clothing and bound wrists. The Alpha King's arrival was announced by a herald's booming voice, and the effect on the assembled court was immediate and absolute. Every noble present dropped to their knees in perfect unified motion, silks pooling against polished stone floor, heads bowed in practiced deference that clearly required no conscious thought whatsoever. Isla remained standing. She felt the shift in the room immediately. The collective intake of breath, the way guards positioned near the throne straightened with sudden alertness, the whispers beginning to ripple through kneeling nobles who dared to glance sideways at the spectacle of open defiance unfolding before them. Alpha King Roarke entered from a side chamber, and Isla understood immediately why an entire hall of nobles bowed without hesitation. He was tall, powerfully built, dark hair swept back from a face carved with the particular severity of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His eyes, when they found her standing alone amid a sea of bowed heads, were a startling ice blue, sharp and assessing in a way that made her pulse hammer despite her determination not to show fear. He crossed toward his throne with unhurried confidence, settling into it with the ease of a man who'd occupied that particular seat his entire adult life before finally addressing the obvious anomaly standing rigid before him. "You may rise," he said to the assembled court, though his gaze remained fixed entirely on Isla. The nobles rose in another unified motion, murmurs of scandalized whispers finally breaking free now that the king himself had acknowledged the unprecedented defiance on display. Roarke commanded, and the guard captain guided Isla toward the dais with a firm but not unkind grip on her bound arms. Rourke's descent from the throne felt endless once he finally rose again, each step deliberate and unhurried, his ice-blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the silence in the hall feel deafening, thick enough to choke on. "Your village owes considerable tax," he said, stopping close enough that Isla had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze properly. "Yet you stand before me in chains, refusing even the basic courtesy every other subject in this room extends freely, without complaint or hesitation." "Basic courtesy," Isla repeated, refusing to let her voice waver despite every instinct screaming at her to look away from that piercing gaze. "Is that what you call forcing starving villages to bow while simultaneously collecting grain they desperately need to survive the coming winter?" A murmur rippled through the watching nobles, considerably louder this time. Rourke's expression didn't visibly change, though something sharpened behind his ice-blue eyes, an intensity that felt distinctly dangerous. "Careful," he said, low enough that only she could hear the warning threaded through the single word. "Most who speak to me this way don't leave this hall standing, let alone breathing." "Then I suppose," Isla said, holding his gaze despite every rational instinct urging otherwise, "I'll simply have to be the exception to that particular rule." Roarke studied her for a long, considering moment, and Isla braced herself for whatever punishment she was now certain would follow such open insolence delivered before his entire watching court. Instead, he turned toward his guards, voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent hall. "Release her chains," he said. "I'll hear her grievance personally, in my private chambers, where she can explain in considerably more detail exactly why her village believes itself above the laws governing every other territory in this kingdom. The guards exchanged uncertain glances before moving to comply, and Isla felt the cold iron finally fall away from her wrists, replaced by something considerably more unsettling, the weight of an Alpha King's undivided, curious attention. Rourke's private study proved warmer than the throne room had been, firelight replacing cold stone and iron sconces, though Isla remained wary despite the change in surroundings, watching him circle behind a heavy wooden desk with unreadable calm. "Explain," he said, settling into his chair, ice blue eyes fixed on her with the same unsettling intensity he'd shown in the throne room. "Not with insults this time, as you offered so freely in front of my entire court. With facts, if you're capable of presenting them without the theatrics." Isla took a steadying breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze, despite the considerable power difference the empty room made even more apparent than the crowded hall had. "The grain tax doubled this year, Your Majesty, with no warning issued to any of the border villages, and no explanation offered beyond a single decree delivered by tax collectors who clearly expected immediate, unquestioning compliance." "The Treasury Council determined the increase was necessary," Roarke said. "Border defenses require funding, particularly given increased raider activity along the eastern territories these past several months." "Perhaps," Isla said, "your Treasury Council should have considered consulting the villages actually expected to pay that double tax rather than simply issuing decrees from the comfort of this castle. My village barely survived last winter as it stood, Your Majesty. Doubling our tax burden now, with no warning and no transition period, means children will go hungry come the first snowfall. That's not defiance for its own sake. That's simple arithmetic anyone willing to actually examine the numbers could easily verify." Something flickered across Rourke's expression at this. Not quite anger, though something considerably more thoughtful than the cold authority he'd projected in the throne room. "You speak plainly," he observed, "considerably more plainly than anyone else who's addressed me directly in recent memory, nobles included." "I've never learned another way of speaking, Your Majesty," Isla admitted. "My village doesn't have much patience for careful diplomacy when survival itself is the actual subject under discussion." "Apparently not," Roarke agreed, leaning back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest that made her pulse quicken despite her determination to remain unaffected by royal attention. "Most who stand where you're currently standing spend considerable effort attempting to flatter their way toward leniency rather than simply stating uncomfortable truths regardless of consequence." "Flattery seemed unlikely to feed my village through the winter," Isla said. "I thought honesty, however unwelcome, might actually accomplish something useful instead." Roarke studied her for a long moment, firelight catching the sharp intelligence evident in her expression despite the considerable exhaustion 2 days of hard travel had clearly left behind. "My council didn't consult the villages before implementing this tax increase," he admitted slowly, the confession seeming to cost him some visible effort. "I approved the decision based on reports emphasizing border defense necessities, reports that apparently failed to account adequately for what you're describing regarding actual conditions in the territories most affected. Reports written by people who've likely never missed a single meal in their comfortable lives," Isla said, unable to keep a certain bitterness from creeping into her voice, despite her best effort at maintaining composure before royal authority. "Apparently not," Roarke agreed again, something almost rueful entering his tone now, considerably softer than the commanding authority he displayed throughout their earlier exchange. I find myself reconsidering several of my counsel's recent decisions now that I'm hearing directly from someone actually affected by their consequences, rather than simply reviewing reports filtered through several layers of comfortable bureaucratic distance. Is that an apology, Your Majesty? Isla asked, unable to keep a certain challenge from her voice despite the danger in questioning him so directly. It's an acknowledgement, Roarke corrected carefully. I don't offer apologies easily or often, if I'm being entirely honest with you, but I do listen when someone actually bothers speaking honestly instead of simply bowing and agreeing with whatever I've already decided, as everyone else in that throne room apparently considers their only acceptable option. Then perhaps, Isla said, feeling something unexpected loosen slightly in her chest despite every instinct urging continued caution. You should surround yourself with people willing to listen more often, Your Majesty. Nobles who bow without question aren't offering you loyalty, they're simply offering you comfortable silence. Perhaps, Roarke said, something almost like the ghost of a smile touching his otherwise severe features. I should keep you close enough to remind me of that particular distinction whenever I'm tempted to forget it. That sounds considerably more complicated than a simple tax dispute, Your Majesty. Perhaps, Roarke agreed, rising from his desk slowly. Complicated matters occasionally prove worth the considerable trouble they inevitably cause. Word spread quickly through the castle that the Alpha King had spared the defiant border girl rather than punishing her insolence as tradition and precedent both demanded, and not everyone within those stone walls welcomed the unexpected development. Lord Ashby, head of the Treasury Council responsible for drafting and implementing the grain tax increase, cornered Isla in a quiet castle corridor within days of her arrival, his expression carrying none of the false courtesy she'd grown accustomed to from other nobles curious about her sudden presence. "You've made yourself a considerable problem," Ashby said coldly, positioning himself directly in her path with obvious, deliberate intent. He was a narrow-faced man, silver threading through dark hair, dressed in the fine, understated fabrics that marked him as someone accustomed to wielding influence quietly rather than through obvious displays of wealth. Questioning council decisions before the entire court, undermining policy matters you clearly don't fully understand despite your evident confidence in speaking about them. I understand hunger considerably better than your council apparently does, Isla replied evenly, refusing to let his obvious attempt at intimidation show any visible effect. That knowledge seems entirely relevant to policy specifically concerning grain taxation, regardless of whatever technical, financial matters your council considers more pressing. The king won't protect you forever, Ashby mourned, voice dropping lower, carrying an edge of genuine threat beneath the carefully controlled surface. Novelty fades quickly in this court, girl. Once His Majesty's curiosity regarding your particular brand of insolence inevitably wanes, you'll find this castle considerably less forgiving toward border peasants who've forgotten their proper place. Is that a threat, Lord Ashby? Consider it practical advice, Ashby said, from someone who's watched considerably more capable people than yourself lose royal favor far more quickly than they anticipated. Enjoy whatever brief attention you're currently receiving. I suspect it won't last nearly as long as you're apparently hoping. He departed without waiting for her response, leaving Isla standing alone in the corridor with her pulse hammering from something considerably more complex than simple fear. Isla relayed the encounter to Roarke that evening, finding him reviewing reports in his study, firelight casting long shadows across features that hardened considerably once she'd finished describing Ashby's veiled threats. Ashby overstepped considerably, Roarke said, setting aside his papers with obvious, controlled fury simmering beneath his outwardly calm demeanor. The tax policy remains under active review at my direct personal order, regardless of whatever timeline he apparently prefers for that particular process. Threatening you directly, however carefully worded, is entirely unacceptable, and he'll answer for it appropriately. He's simply protecting his own position, Isla said, settling into the chair across from his desk, some of her earlier tension finally beginning to ease within the study's warm, familiar atmosphere. I understand that particular motivation, even if I don't excuse the method he's apparently chosen to pursue it. You've upended council assumptions that have gone entirely unchallenged for considerably longer than either of us have been alive, Roarke said. That inevitably creates enemies among those who've benefited most from policies remaining comfortably unexamined. Does that particular consequence trouble you, Your Majesty? Roarke considered this question carefully, studying her with an expression she was slowly learning to read, despite his generally guarded demeanor. It troubles me considerably less than the alternative would, he admitted finally. A court populated entirely by advisors who only ever tell me precisely what they believe I want to hear, regardless of whatever uncomfortable truths might actually require my attention. I find I'd rather have your honesty, Isla, along with whatever resentment it inevitably generates from people like Ashby, than comfortable lies delivered by everyone else surrounding me. That's a considerably lonely way to rule a kingdom, Isla agreed, something unexpectedly vulnerable entering his voice for just a moment before his usual composure reasserted itself. Considerably lonelier than I generally allow myself to acknowledge, if I'm being entirely honest with you, the way you've apparently decided to always be honest with me. Isla felt something shift in her chest at this admission, a warmth she hadn't anticipated feeling toward a man she'd arrived intending only to challenge, not to understand. Perhaps, she said carefully, that particular loneliness doesn't have to continue indefinitely, Your Majesty. Rourke's ice-blue eyes met hers directly, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed quite ready to name aloud. The tax reversal, when Roarke formally announced it before the full assembled council 1 week later, sent visible shock waves through the chamber, several nobles exchanging alarmed glances, while others simply stared in open disbelief at the abrupt reversal of policy they'd considered entirely settled. Effective immediately, Roarke declared, voice carrying easily across the stunned silence, the grain tax increase implemented this season is rescinded entirely, reverting to previous rates until a proper review, conducted with direct consultation from affected territories, determines appropriate future policy. Isla watched from her position near the chamber's edge, uncertain of her welcome among nobles who'd clearly identified her as the catalyst for this unprecedented reversal, though she found she cared considerably less about their obvious disapproval than she might have expected. "You've made real enemies today," Roarke told her afterward, finding her in a quiet corridor once the council session had finally concluded. "I didn't ask for easy," Isla said simply. "I asked fair. Those two things were never going to be the same outcome, given how entrenched certain interests apparently were in maintaining an unjust system." "I know," Roarke said, something warm entering his usually controlled voice, considerably softer than the commanding authority he'd projected throughout the council session. "It's part of why I find myself wanting you to remain in this court considerably longer than any simple tax dispute actually requires, Isla. You've changed something in how I approach governing, in ways I hadn't anticipated when you first refused to kneel in my throne room." Isla's breath caught slightly at the direction this conversation seemed to be taking. "Your Majesty?" "Roarke," he corrected quietly, closing some of the distance between them. "When we're alone together, at least, I'd prefer you use my actual name rather than my title. Roarke, Isla amended carefully, testing the informality on her tongue, aware of how significantly this small linguistic shift represented something considerably larger between them. You understand what you're suggesting complicates matters significantly. I'm not noble-born, nor prepared for court politics, nor familiar with whatever expectations inevitably accompany standing beside a reigning king. Neither was I once, Roarke said, moving closer still, close enough now that Isla had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I learned everything I currently know through considerable trial and frequent error. You could learn as well, Isla, if you actually wanted to pursue that particular path. And if I don't want the crown itself, Isla asked, only genuine fairness extended toward my people and others like them throughout this kingdom? Then perhaps, Roarke said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate than she'd yet heard him speak, the crown proves fortunate enough that both outcomes might actually prove possible simultaneously, rather than mutually exclusive as you're currently assuming. He reached out slowly, giving her ample opportunity to step back if she chose, fingers gently tracing along her jaw with a tenderness that felt entirely at odds with the commanding alpha king she'd first encountered in that cold, unforgiving throne room. I've spent considerable time these past weeks, he continued quietly, trying to convince myself that whatever I'm feeling toward you represents nothing more than simple curiosity, or perhaps admiration for someone brave enough to challenge decisions everyone else simply accepted without question. I no longer believe that particular explanation adequately covers what's actually happening between us. And what is happening between us, exactly? Isla asked, voice barely above a whisper. I believe, Roarke said, you already know the answer to that question, Isla, considerably better than I'm currently managing to articulate it myself. He kissed her then, unhurried and certain, despite the obvious vulnerability the gesture represented for a man rarely permitted such open displays of genuine emotion. And Isla felt every careful wall she'd constructed during 2 days of chained travel crumbling despite her every intention otherwise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing slightly unsteady, Roarke rested his forehead gently against hers. Stay, he said, simply, not because I command it as your king, but because I'm asking you as myself, entirely separate from whatever title accompanies my birth. I'll stay, Isla said, surprising herself with how easily the words emerged, how right they felt despite every practical concern she'd carried into this castle just weeks before. Though I suspect Lord Ashby will have considerably more to say about that particular decision. Let him, Roarke said, something almost like genuine amusement entering his expression for the first time since she'd met him. I find myself considerably less concerned with his opinion than I once was. Lord Ashby's final scheme unraveled precisely 1 week later, when General Merrick, head of the castle guard, and one of the few council members who'd remained quietly loyal to Rourke's judgment throughout the recent upheaval, intercepted a forged document bearing Isla's signature, supposed correspondence with known border rebels suggesting treasonous coordination against the crown itself. The forgery is convincing, Merrick admitted, presenting the document to Roarke in his private study, Isla standing tensely beside him as they examined the damning evidence together. Convincing enough that, presented before the full council without warning, it might have proven sufficient to justify her immediate arrest, regardless of any protection you've extended thus far. Whose handwriting analysis confirmed the forgery? Roarke asked, jaw tight with barely controlled fury as he studied the document more closely. Master Aldous, the court's chief scribe, Merrick said. He's prepared to testify that the signature doesn't match samples of Isla's actual handwriting we've collected these past weeks, and that certain phrasing throughout the letter matches known writing patterns belonging to Lord Ashby's personal secretary. Ashby, Roarke said, the single name carrying considerable weight, confirming what both he and Isla had already suspected the moment Merrick first described the forged correspondence. He grew desperate, Isla said quietly, once the tax reversal became public knowledge. Once it became clear his influence over council policy was diminishing considerably faster than he'd anticipated. Desperate enough to attempt treason charges against you directly, rather than simply accepting his declining influence gracefully. The confrontation, when it finally happened before the full council the following morning, proved swift and thoroughly damning. Master Aldous presented his handwriting analysis with methodical precision, comparing the forged letter against genuine samples of both Isla's actual writing and Ashby's secretary's distinctive style, the evidence leaving little room for reasonable doubt among the assembled nobles. Ashby's composure cracked entirely once the analysis concluded, his careful mask of wounded innocence dissolving into something considerably more desperate. "This is absurd," he protested, though his voice carried none of its earlier confident authority. "A border peasant's word against evidence," Roarke interrupted, voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent chamber, presented by this court's own chief scribe, whose integrity none among you have ever previously questioned. You attempted to manufacture treason charges against an innocent woman, Ashby, purely to preserve your own diminishing influence over policy decisions. Ashby was stripped of his council seat that same day, his considerable influence finally, thoroughly extinguished, escorted from the castle grounds under guard as the assembled court watched in stunned silence. "You could have simply let his scheme fail on its own merits," Isla observed that evening, finding Roarke in his study reviewing the day's considerable upheaval with visible exhaustion. "Why intervene so directly and publicly, risking your own political capital defending me before the entire council?" "Because you're not simply some passing curiosity to me any longer, Isla," Roarke said, rising from his desk to close the distance between them. "You're the reason this court has finally begun genuinely listening to the people it's actually meant to serve, rather than simply perpetuating comfortable policies benefiting only those already privileged to influence them. I won't allow anyone to undermine that progress easily, regardless of whatever political cost defending it might require." Their coronation, when it finally happened 1 month later, drew both nobles and villagers alike to witness the ceremony, the first time in the kingdom's considerable history that commoners had been formally welcomed to observe a royal wedding and coronation combined, rather than remaining excluded entirely from proceedings affecting their own governance. Isla stood before the assembled crowd in simple, elegant blue rather than elaborate royal finery, a deliberate choice marking this ceremony as distinctly different from tradition, while Roarke waited beside her in formal royal attire, ice blue eyes warm with an emotion she'd learned to treasure considerably more than she'd ever expected when she'd first arrived in chains. "Do you take this woman," the priest asked, "as your queen and true partner in governing this kingdom, in honesty rather than comfortable silence?" "I do," Roarke said, voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd of nobles and villagers standing together, more certainly than any decision I've made throughout my entire reign as king. Isla looked out at the assembled crowd, people who would never have been permitted such proximity to royal ceremony under previous tradition, now standing together in genuine unity, and thought that perhaps refusing to kneel that first day had been the wisest decision she'd ever made in her entire life. "I do," she said, and meant every word completely, without hesitation or doubt. When Roarke kissed her before the assembled crowd, the resulting cheer from both nobles and villagers alike confirmed everything Isla had hoped this kingdom might someday become: a court finally willing to listen and a crown finally worth honoring.